Did you notice how it didn't come with a speech? No balcony appearance. No dramatic announcement. No emergency headlines screaming across the screen. Just silence. And sometimes, silence is the loudest warning of all. Because while the world was busy arguing over the same old clips, the same recycled outrage, and the same predictable talking points, something far more devastating was already underway. Something quiet. Something surgical. Something that didn't need defending because it had already been decided. And here's the uncomfortable question you're probably not asking yet, but should be. What if the real end of Harry and Meghan's royal relevance didn't come from an interview, but from a single, calculated move made without them in the room? Let that sink in. For years, the narrative has been loud, explosive, emotional, tears on camera, accusations, rebuttals, apologies that never came. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But power doesn't behave like that. Power doesn't argue. Power doesn't explain itself. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Power waits, and then it moves once. Tonight, we're starting at the exact moment that move was made. Not when the headlines caught up. Not when commentators started speculating, but when the shift actually happened. The moment insiders say the chessboard changed and there was no way to flip it back. Because this isn't just another royal disagreement. This is about names being erased, titles quietly stripped of meaning, a charity rebranded in a way that sent shockwaves through donor circles. And most of all, it's about two people realizing, far too late, that they were no longer part of the conversation. Let me ask you something directly. Have you ever lost something important without anyone telling you it was gone? No confrontation. No warning, just a realization that doors you assumed were open suddenly weren't. That's the feeling sources say hit Prince Harry first. Not rage, not defiance, shock. Because for all the noise of the past few years, Harry still believed something fundamental, something emotional, something almost naive. That blood still mattered, that history still counted. That at the end of the day, there were lines that wouldn't be crossed. But what if those lines weren't crossed at all? What if they were simply walked around? This is where the story gets uncomfortable. Not because it's loud, but because it's cold. On the other side of this shift stand Prince William and Catherine. And before you jump to conclusions, no, this isn't about public retaliation. There was no speech, no counter-interview, no emotional rebuttal designed for applause. Instead, there was something far more dangerous. Preparation. While public attention stayed fixed on grievance and drama, something else was happening behind closed doors. Meetings, reviews, structural decisions. The kind of conversations that don't trend, but determine outcomes. And here's the contradiction that most people miss. The louder Harry and Meghan became, the quieter William and Catherine grew. Why would that matter? Because silence isn't weakness when you're holding the pen. Ask yourself this. Who controls names? Who controls access? Who decides what still counts as royal when the cameras are off? This story matters now because for the first time, those questions appear to have answers. And they don't favor the people who relied on attention as leverage. According to multiple insiders, the real blow wasn't emotional. It was administrative. It came in the form of paperwork, approvals, and subtle adjustments that redefined what Harry and Meghan thought they still owned. A charity name altered in a way that changed everything. Titles that remained technically intact, but functionally hollowed out. Institutional doors that didn't slam shut, they simply stopped opening. And that's what makes this moment different from every fight before it. This wasn't reactive. It was final. Now let's talk about Meghan for a moment. Because while Harry's reaction was reportedly stunned disbelief, Meghan Markle felt something else entirely. Recognition. Sources describe a slow, creeping understanding that something fundamental had shifted. Not a fight to be won, not a narrative to spin, but a framework that no longer centered them. Think about that. For years, Meghan has been portrayed as calculating, strategic, always 2 steps ahead. But what happens when the game changes without you being told the rules? That's where frustration turns into panic. Because branding only works if you still own the brand. Advocacy only works if institutions still listen. And influence only matters if the people with real authority still return your calls. And quietly, those calls started going unanswered. Not dramatically, not rudely, just delayed, redirected. Forgotten. Here's the part that should make you pause. None of this required a single public attack. No one had to accuse. No one had to deny. No one had to explain. Which begs the question, if this was revenge, wouldn't it have been louder? And if it wasn't revenge, then what was it? The answer insiders keep circling back to is unsettling. Containment. Not exile. Not punishment. Containment. The idea that rather than fighting Harry and Meghan head-on, the institution simply redefined the boundaries of relevance, reduced their ability to operate, limited their reach, and did it all in ways that appear neutral on the surface. Because here's the thing about institutions. They don't get emotional. They get procedural. And procedure is where battles are really won. This is why the charity rename sent such a chill through certain circles. On paper, it looked administrative, harmless, even sensible. But names are more than labels. They carry history. They attract donors. They signal legitimacy. And once that name changed, people inside the system understood something immediately. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't negotiable. This was a line being redrawn. And Harry? Harry was reportedly still trying to process how he got here. Raised inside the system. Protected by it. Defined by it. Now watching it move on without him. That's a different kind of grief. Not anger. Not sadness. Irrelevance. And if you think that sounds dramatic, ask yourself this. What scares powerful people more than being criticized? Being ignored. That's why this moment matters. Not because of tears. Not because of headlines. But because of what didn't happen. No outreach. No compromise. No back-channel reconciliation. Just a quiet sense that the future had been decided without them. And here's where we need to slow down. Because the most devastating part of this story hasn't even surfaced yet. The charity change was only the first visible sign. The title implications were only the surface ripple. What followed next was something far more personal. Something that cut deeper than branding or protocol. Something that forced Harry to confront a truth he had spent years avoiding. That loyalty doesn't always leave in a fight. Sometimes it leaves in silence. And the moment he realized that, that's where everything truly began to unravel. But what came next wasn't emotional. It was strategic, and it would change the balance of power forever. What if the moment everything changed wasn't dramatic at all? What if it didn't happen under flashing cameras, or during some explosive phone call, or in the middle of a public showdown? What if it happened quietly, bureaucratically, almost politely? That's the part people struggle to understand. Because when we imagine power shifting, we imagine shouting. Ultimatums. Someone slamming a door. Someone else breaking down in tears. But that's not how this started. According to multiple insiders, the day everything changed began like any other ordinary day. No alarms. No urgent messages. No sense that history was about to tilt on its axis. And that's exactly why it worked. This chapter begins at the moment silence stopped being neutral. Ask yourself something. When was the last time you noticed something important disappear? Only after it was already gone. That's how this unfolded. The shift didn't arrive as a confrontation. It arrived as a delay. A meeting that didn't get scheduled. An email that didn't get answered. A routine process that suddenly required additional review. Nothing dramatic enough to protest. Just enough to feel wrong. Inside palace-adjacent circles, there's a phrase people use when something powerful is happening quietly. They say, the temperature dropped. Not frozen. Not hostile. Just colder. That's how insiders describe the early signs of what would later be understood as a decisive repositioning by Prince William and Catherine. And here's where the story starts to challenge expectations. There was no emergency meeting to deal with Harry and Meghan. No dramatic strategy session focused on retaliation. No emotional debriefing over interviews or grievances. Instead, there was something far more unsettling. Normal governance. Routine oversight. Long-term planning. While the public narrative was stuck replaying old arguments, the institution itself was already looking forward. And in doing so, it began quietly asking a question that would change everything. What role, exactly, do Harry and Meghan still play? That question alone is lethal. Because once it's asked inside an institution, everything gets reevaluated. Not emotionally. Structurally. Budgets. Access. Naming rights. Associations. And this is where the first real crack appeared. It didn't happen in California. It didn't happen on television. It happened in paperwork. Sources say the initial trigger was not anger, but audit. a standard review process that would normally pass unnoticed. Except this time, it didn't. Someone paused. Someone asked for clarification. Someone flagged a detail that had always been waved through before. And suddenly, what had once been automatic became conditional. Here's the contradiction that makes this so difficult to grasp. Harry and Meghan believed they had exited the institution. The institution believed it had simply reclassified them. Those are two very different realities. For Harry, this was deeply personal. He had grown up inside a system where hierarchy was invisible because it was everywhere. Titles weren't just honors. They were keys. Keys that opened rooms, phones, and possibilities. And even after stepping back, Harry believed those keys still worked. Not because he demanded it, but because they always had. That assumption is where everything went wrong. Because while Harry was operating on memory and emotion, William was operating on structure and future-proofing. And the future doesn't run on sentiment. According to insiders, there was a specific internal moment when the shift became irreversible. Not public, not recorded, but unmistakable to those who know how these systems work. A document circulated. Routine language. Neutral tone. But one line stood out. A line that reframed how certain associations were categorized. Not removed. Redefined. This is where we need to slow down, because this is the part people misinterpret. No one stripped anything overnight. No one issued decrees. Instead, definitions changed. And in institutional environments, definitions are destiny. When a charity is described differently in internal documents, its relationship to the crown changes. When names are repositioned in official contexts, their meaning shifts. And once that happens, everything downstream follows. Funding conversations. Partnerships. Visibility. It's like changing a river's course miles upstream. By the time the water reaches the city, the damage is already done. This was the day the river changed direction. But here's the most revealing detail. Harry wasn't informed. Not because someone was being cruel, but because, procedurally, there was nothing to inform him of. No rule had been broken. No punishment issued. The system simply moved. And that's when the calls began to feel strange. According to people close to the situation, Harry noticed it first in the tone of conversations. Advisors who used to be proactive became careful. Responses became measured. Language softened. We'll look into that. Let's revisit this later. We'll circle back. Those phrases are harmless in everyday life. Inside institutions, they mean something else entirely. They mean you're no longer a priority. And once you're no longer a priority, you're already on borrowed time. Meghan sensed it too, but differently. Where Harry felt confusion, Meghan felt resistance. She noticed doors didn't open as easily. That enthusiasm felt thinner. That people who once leaned and now leaned back. Not hostile, just cautious. And caution, when it's sudden, is terrifying. Because caution signals risk. And nothing drains influence faster than being labeled risky. This is the moment where narratives collide. Publicly, Harry and Meghan were still headline makers. Still controversial. Still talked about. Privately, they were becoming something else. Complicated. And institutions don't like complicated. They like predictable. They like manageable. They like contained. That word again. Contained. This wasn't about silencing them. It was about limiting the blast radius. And the most unsettling part? William and Catherine didn't have to do anything overt. They simply didn't intervene. They didn't stop the process. They didn't override reviews. They didn't make exceptions. They let the system behave exactly as it was designed to. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If the institution moved this way so smoothly, what does that say about how ready it was? Think about that. Systems don't change overnight unless they've been prepared to. And preparation takes time. Years, sometimes. Which suggests that this moment wasn't sparked by a single interview or a single disagreement. It was the culmination of a slow recalibration. A gradual shift from family complication to external variable. And once you're an external variable, you're treated differently. Access becomes formal. Language becomes legal. Relationships become transactional. Harry wasn't prepared for that. He had lived his entire life believing that whatever happened, he was still inside the circle. Now he was discovering the circle had tightened, and he was standing just outside it. The charity rename, which would later explode into public discussion, was already being quietly discussed in these early stages. Not as a punishment, as a necessity. Insiders say the logic was simple and chilling. If an organization's name implies a connection that creates confusion, liability, or misinterpretation, that name must be clarified. That's how it was framed. Neutral, sensible, responsible. But to those who understood the subtext, it was seismic. Because names don't just clarify. They signal. They tell donors who is protected. They tell partners who is endorsed. They tell the world who still belongs. And the moment that name became unstable, everything attached to it did too. Harry reportedly learned about the shift indirectly. Not from an official source, not from a call, but from the absence of reassurance. He expected someone to step in. Someone always had before, but no one did. And that's when it began to dawn on him. This wasn't an oversight. This was a decision. Meghan, meanwhile, was doing what she does best. Assessing, reframing, looking for leverage. But leverage only works when the other side needs something from you. And increasingly, it appeared they didn't. That realization hits differently when you're used to momentum. Because momentum feels permanent. Until it isn't. Here's where the emotional weight deepens. Harry wasn't just losing influence. He was losing familiarity. The subtle signals he had relied on his entire life were changing. The cues were different. The language colder. And worst of all, no one was explaining why. Because explanations imply negotiation. And negotiation was no longer on the table. This chapter ends at the precise moment Harry finally understood something he had been shielded from his entire life. Power doesn't always confront you when it's done with you. Sometimes it simply stops including you. And the moment Harry realized that silence wasn't accidental, that it was intentional, that it was strategic, everything inside him shifted. Because if this was deliberate, then what else was already in motion? And more importantly, what was about to be taken next? Why didn't they fight back? That's the question people keep asking. And it's the wrong one. Because the most dangerous thing William and Catherine did was nothing at all. No rebuttal, no press leaks, no emotional counterstrike. Just patience. And patience, in this context, wasn't passive. It was deliberate. This chapter begins with a truth that most people underestimate. Power doesn't need to prove itself when it already owns the board. By the time Harry and Meghan sensed the temperature drop, Prince William and Catherine were no longer reacting to them. They were planning around them. That distinction matters. Because reacting keeps you trapped in someone else's narrative. Planning lets you write your own. And quietly, methodically, William had been learning how to do exactly that. For years, he was portrayed as cautious, stiff, even dull. The reliable heir who lacked charisma compared to his younger brother's emotional volatility. But that image hid something important. William was watching. He was studying how institutions survive scandal, how public outrage burns hot and fast, while structural change moves slowly and lasts forever. And Catherine? She was absorbing everything. Not in front of cameras, not in sound bites, but in rooms where tone matters more than volume. Here's what most people miss. William and Catherine didn't win by being louder. They won by becoming indispensable. While Harry and Meghan leaned into visibility, William and Catherine leaned into continuity, stability, predictability. Ask yourself this. If you're running a centuries-old institution, who do you trust with the future? The people who create volatility? Or the people who quietly absorb it? That's the choice that was being made behind closed doors. And it didn't happen overnight. This long game began years earlier, when William started redefining what leadership would look like in a post-crisis monarchy. A monarchy that had already endured scandal, public skepticism, and internal fractures. He understood something crucial. The next generation wouldn't survive on tradition alone. It would survive on competence. That meant tightening systems, clarifying roles, removing ambiguity. And ambiguity was exactly what Harry and Meghan represented. Not because they spoke out, but because they existed in a gray zone. Half in, half out, half royal, half commercial. That might work in headlines. It does not work in governance. So while public attention was fixated on emotion, William was focusing on architecture. How is influence measured? Who represents what? What associations create risk? These aren't dramatic questions. They're lethal ones. Because once you start asking them, answers follow. And answers lead to action. Catherine's role in this is often underestimated, and that's a mistake. She didn't need to be forceful. She didn't need to be vocal. Her power came from something else entirely. Consistency. Every appearance reinforce. By the time the public even noticed something was wrong, the people who mattered already understood the implication. The charity name was no longer safe. And once that realization set in, the countdown began. Let's rewind to the moment insiders say alarms quietly started going off. It didn't start with outrage. It didn't start with accusations. It started with discomfort. In donor circles, there's an unspoken rule: clarity equals confidence. The moment clarity fades, confidence evaporates. And suddenly, donors were asking questions they had never asked before. Who exactly does this organization represent now? Is this still aligned with the crown, or is it independent? Are contributions indirectly endorsing positions the monarchy does not support? Those questions are poison, not because they're hostile, but because they create liability. And institutions do not tolerate liability masquerading as ambiguity. Here's the contradiction that makes this moment so explosive. Publicly, the charity still existed. Its mission still sounded noble. Its messaging still felt familiar. Privately, however, the perception had shifted. It was no longer seen as a bridge. It was now seen as a risk. That's when advisors began whispering the word no one wanted to say out loud. Rename. Not as punishment, not as revenge, as insulation. Because once a name implies endorsement, and endorsement implies responsibility, the institution has to act. And act it did. Quietly. Methodically. Without asking permission. This is the part that shocks people. There was no negotiation with Prince Harry. No emotional phone call. No, let's talk this through. Why? Because from the system's perspective, there was nothing to negotiate. The issue wasn't personal. It was structural. And structures don't argue. They adjust. Behind the scenes, legal teams reviewed language. Communications teams analyzed risk exposure. Advisors mapped out scenarios. What happens if the charity keeps its current name? What assumptions does that invite? What future controversies does it tether us to? And most importantly, what happens if we do nothing? That last question sealed it. Doing nothing meant accepting indefinite ambiguity. And ambiguity is unacceptable when succession, reputation, and global perception are involved. So the decision was made. Not loudly, but decisively. The name would change. The framing would shift. The association would be clarified. And here's the part that stings. From the institution's point of view, this was responsible governance. From Harry and Meghan's point of view, it felt like erasure. Because names don't just label. They validate. They tell the world you belong somewhere. And once that name was altered, something else happened immediately. Donors hesitated. Not dramatically. Not angrily. They paused. They asked follow-up questions. They requested revised documentation. They waited. And waiting is deadly for momentum. Momentum is oxygen for influence. And suddenly, the oxygen thinned. Meghan Markle reportedly sensed the shift almost immediately. Not through official channels, but through energy. Responses felt colder. Enthusiasm dulled. Certainty wavered. And if you've ever built anything on belief, you know how terrifying that feels. Because belief is fragile. Once it cracks, it doesn't shatter loudly. It leaks away. Here's where the emotional contradiction hits hardest. Harry and Meghan had always framed the charity as independent, as separate, as their own. But the reality was more complex. Its power came from proximity, from implication, from the idea that it still existed within a royal halo. The moment that halo dimmed, the charity had to stand on its own. And standing alone is much harder than it looks, especially when you're used to being elevated. Insiders describe a tense period where advisors scrambled to reframe messaging, to reassure partners, to project continuity. But something essential was missing: institutional backing. And without that, reassurance sounds hollow. Harry, for his part, was reportedly blindsided. Not because he didn't understand the mechanics, but because he underestimated the resolve. He believed there would be pushback, debate, some kind of internal resistance. Instead, the process moved forward smoothly. Too smoothly, which sent a chilling message. This wasn't controversial inside the system. It was consensus. That realization hit hard. Because consensus means the decision wasn't emotional. It was shared. And shared decisions are rarely reversed. Let's pause and ask something important. Why would an institution move so cleanly unless it had already prepared for this outcome? Preparation leaves fingerprints. And those fingerprints were everywhere. Language and internal documents shifted subtly. References were updated. Descriptions became more precise. Nothing dramatic enough to spark headlines. Everything significant enough to alter reality. This is where the word fatal starts to make sense. Not fatal in the sense of destruction. Fatal in the sense of finality. Once the charity's name changed, it marked a point of no return. Because reverting it would require justification. And justification would invite scrutiny. And scrutiny would reopen wounds the institution had already sealed. So the door stayed closed. Meanwhile, Harry and Meghan faced a brutal truth. Their influence had been tied to an identity they no longer controlled. And rebuilding that influence would require something they were rapidly losing. Trust. Trust from donors. Trust from partners. Trust from institutions that value predictability above all else. The irony is painful. They spoke out to reclaim their narrative. But in doing so, they triggered a recalibration that stripped them of the very framework that gave that narrative weight. And William and Catherine? They didn't need to comment. They didn't need to defend the decision. Because the decision wasn't framed as theirs. It was framed as necessary. And necessity is the strongest shield there is. As this chapter closes, understand this. The charity rename wasn't the end. It was the signal. The signal that the system had chosen clarity over compromise. And once clarity is chosen, the next step is always enforcement. Because names are just the beginning. What followed next struck even closer to identity itself. Something Harry had always assumed was untouchable. And when that realization hit, it broke something he never expected to lose. What if the thing you thought could never be taken was never really yours to begin with? Not the house, not the platform, not even the protection, but the word that followed your name. This chapter begins with an illusion, one that Harry clung to longer than anyone realized. The illusion that titles are permanent, that once you are born into them, they are stitched into your identity. Immutable, untouchable, immune to politics, paperwork, and mood. But that illusion only survives if you never look too closely at how titles actually work. Because titles are not just honors. They are mechanisms. And mechanisms can be disengaged. Quietly. Without a ceremony. Without a confrontation. That's what makes this chapter so uncomfortable. Because no one stood up and announced that Harry and Meghan's titles were being removed. Instead, something far more effective happened. Their titles stopped doing anything. Ask yourself this. What is a title worth if it no longer opens doors? What does it mean to be a duke or duchess when institutions stop treating you like one? That's the reality Harry was walking into. And he didn't see it coming. For years after stepping back, Harry believed the titles were symbolic but secure, that they would remain a kind of safety net, a permanent reminder that no matter how far he went, he still belonged to something bigger. That belief wasn't arrogance. It was conditioning. Harry had spent his entire life in a world where titles didn't need to be explained. They simply worked. They conferred status, access, and deference without question. But what happens when the system decides to reinterpret what those titles mean? Not remove them. Redefine them. This is where the shift becomes devastating. Because redefining something doesn't look like punishment. It looks like policy. Insiders describe a subtle but sweeping change in how Harry and Meghan were referenced in official contexts. Not publicly, but internally. Language adjusted. Context shifted. Titles remained technically intact, but their functional value evaporated. Invitations that once arrived automatically now required justification. Introductions that once carried weight now felt awkward. Associations that once implied endorsement now raised eyebrows. This wasn't accidental. It was intentional distancing. And it worked precisely because it looked neutral. Let's talk about how institutions think. They don't ask, can we take this away? They ask, do we still need to support this? That's a very different question. And once that question is asked, everything changes. Because support is discretionary. And discretion can be withdrawn without drama. This is where Harry felt the ground shift under his feet. Not in a single moment, but in a series of interactions that felt off. Meetings where his presence was acknowledged but not prioritized. Conversations where his opinion was heard but not acted on. Spaces where his title was noted but no longer deferred to. That's when it began to sink in. The title still existed on paper, but its power had been hollowed out. And hollow power is more humiliating than no power at all, because it forces you to confront the gap between how you see yourself and how others see you now. Meghan understood this faster. She had never grown up inside the system, which meant she wasn't blinded by nostalgia. She noticed patterns, energy, shifts in tone. She saw that the title no longer smoothed over friction. Instead, it sometimes created it. Because now, the title raised questions. Is this still appropriate? Is this still aligned? Is this still sanctioned? And when a title starts triggering questions instead of answers, it becomes a liability. That's the cruel paradox. The thing that once elevated you can become the thing that isolates you. Harry, meanwhile, struggled with something deeper. Identity. He wasn't just losing influence. He was losing certainty. For the first time in his life, he couldn't rely on the system to define him. And that's terrifying when your entire upbringing has been structured around that definition. Think about it. Harry didn't choose his title. It chose him. It shaped how people spoke to him, protected him, excused him. Now, suddenly, it wasn't doing any of that. And no one was explaining why. Because explanation would imply accountability. And accountability would imply negotiation. Neither were being offered. Here's where the contradiction sharpens. Publicly, Harry and Meghan were still being referred to by their titles in media coverage. But behind the scenes, those titles were being quietly sidelined. Institutions began referring to them in different ways. Partnerships were framed more cautiously. Legal language grew precise. Precision is never accidental. Precision is defensive. It's what happens when an institution wants to limit exposure. And titles are exposure. Titles imply endorsement. Endorsement implies responsibility. And responsibility is something the system was actively shedding. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about insulation. William understood this instinctively. As the future king, he had spent years learning how fragile legitimacy can be, how quickly association can become liability. And he knew something Harry didn't. The crown doesn't protect individuals. It protects itself. Everything else is secondary. So when the system began quietly detaching Harry and Meghan's titles from meaningful function, it wasn't personal. It was preventative. And that made it unstoppable. Because you can't argue with prevention. You can't appeal to it emotionally. You can only watch it happen. Harry reportedly oscillated between disbelief and anger. Not outwardly. Internally. He kept expecting a line to be drawn. A conversation. Some acknowledgement that this had gone too far. But no one ever said it had gone anywhere at all. That's the genius of the move. Nothing was taken. Nothing was announced. Everything simply changed. And the more Harry tried to assert relevance, the clearer it became that relevance had to be granted. And it wasn't. This is where the phrase removing their titles becomes misleading. Because no one had to remove them. They were rendered inert. And inert titles are worse than none at all. They create the illusion of power without its substance. They invite expectations you can no longer fulfill. They trap you between what you were and what you've become. Meghan felt that trap tightening. She saw how the title that once amplified her voice now complicated it. How it made some doors harder to open, not easier. And she understood something crucial. The system wasn't trying to silence them. It was trying to neutralize them. Neutralization doesn't require force. It requires patience. And William had plenty of that. From his perspective, this was about future-proofing, ensuring that no matter what narratives emerged, the core institution remained untouched. And the easiest way to do that? Detach titles from unpredictable actors, without ever saying that's what you're doing. This chapter marks the point where Harry realized something he had never fully accepted. Being born royal doesn't guarantee lifelong relevance. Relevance has to be renewed, and the system had decided not to renew his. That realization didn't come with a dramatic confrontation. It came in a quiet moment of clarity. A moment where Harry understood that whatever leverage he thought he had was gone. And if titles could be rendered meaningless so easily, what else could be taken next? Because the system hadn't finished adjusting yet. Not even close. What happens when control slips, and there's nothing left to grab? Not a statement. Not a strategy. Not even outrage. Just the sudden realization that the levers you thought you understood no longer respond. This chapter begins at Meghan's breaking point. Not the public one. Not the tabloid-friendly version. The private one. Because while Harry was still trying to reconcile loss with loyalty, Meghan Markle was confronting something far more destabilizing. Irrelevance. Not in the sense of disappearing headlines, but in the sense that the systems she once navigated so confidently were no longer predictable. And unpredictability is Meghan's nightmare. Let's be clear about something. Meghan does not move blindly. She plans. She anticipates. She calibrates. Every move she's ever made has been about positioning herself where leverage exists. Hollywood taught her that. Media taught her that. Life taught her that. So when the signals began changing, not loudly, but unmistakably, she noticed. Before Harry did. Before advisors admitted it. Before anyone dared say it out loud. She noticed that responses felt thinner. That conversations ended sooner. That enthusiasm evaporated faster than expected. And most unsettling of all, that reassurance stopped coming. Here's a question worth asking. When was the last time someone powerful reassured you without you asking? That's how Meghan had operated for years. Validation came preemptively. Support arrived automatically. The system bent to accommodate her presence. Now, nothing bent. It stood still. And that's how she knew. This wasn't a temporary chill. This was a structural freeze. Meghan's breaking point didn't arrive in a single dramatic moment. It crept in through 1,000 micro-frustrations. Emails that required follow-ups. Calls that went to voicemail. Meetings that were postponed indefinitely. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. And patterns are impossible to unsee once they emerge. This is where the contradiction hits hardest. Meghan had always believed that visibility equaled power. That if she stayed visible enough, vocal enough, relevant enough, the system would have to engage. But what happens when the system decides visibility is the problem? What happens when your presence is no longer an asset, but a complication? That's the question Meghan found herself wrestling with late at night. Because every instinct she had screamed the same thing. Fight back. Clarify the narrative. Reassert control. But here's the trap. You can't reassert control over a system that no longer recognizes your authority. And the more Meghan pushed, the more she felt the resistance. Not confrontation. Deflection. That's what made it unbearable. Confrontation is something you can respond to. Deflection leaves you shouting into a void. Sources describe a period where Meghan oscillated between frustration and calculation. She wasn't breaking down emotionally in the way tabloids love to suggest. She was recalculating, trying to understand what had shifted and where leverage might still exist. And what she found was deeply unsettling. The usual pressure points weren't working. Media attention didn't move the needle. Public sympathy didn't unlock doors. Even donor enthusiasm felt conditional. Conditional. That word should haunt you. Because conditional support isn't support. It's probation. And Meghan had never been on probation before. Let's talk about expectations. Meghan entered the royal world believing one fundamental thing. That if she played the role convincingly enough, the institution would adapt around her. And for a time, it did. But institutions don't adapt forever. Eventually, they defend. And when they defend, they don't negotiate on your terms. They impose theirs. Meghan's breaking point came when she realized she was no longer being evaluated as a person. She was being evaluated as a variable, a risk factor, a potential liability. And once you're labeled that way, everything changes. Every interaction becomes cautious. Every offer becomes qualified. Every endorsement becomes provisional. This is where the emotional toll deepened. Because Meghan wasn't just losing influence. She was losing predictability. And predictability is how strategists survive. Without it, every move feels reactive. And reactive behavior is the enemy of control. Harry, meanwhile, was still emotionally processing. Still hoping for reconciliation. Still believing that this was all a misunderstanding that could be resolved with the right conversation. Meghan didn't share that hope. She couldn't afford to. Because hope is passive. And passivity is dangerous when the ground is shifting beneath you. This divergence created tension. Not explosive tension. Quiet tension. The kind that settles into rooms and conversations without announcing itself. Harry wanted to wait. Meghan wanted to act. But act how? That was the problem. Every potential move seemed to backfire. Push too hard, and you confirmed the institution's fears. Stay quiet, and you faded further into the background. It was a no-win scenario. And Meghan saw it clearly. This wasn't a battlefield where she could outmaneuver her opponent. This was a fortress with no open gates. That realization hit hardest during interactions with allies who suddenly sounded cautious. Not critical. Cautious. They chose their words carefully. They avoided definitive statements. They spoke in hypotheticals. That's when Meghan understood something chilling. At first, Harry told himself it was temporary. Stress. Transition. miscommunication. But then came the moment that changed everything. Not dramatic, not explosive, just clarifying. According to people close to him, Harry was told about a decision after it had already been made. Not asked, not consulted, informed. That word hit him harder than any insult ever could. Informed. It meant he was no longer part of the process. He was no longer inside the room. He was being briefed on outcomes, not shaping them. And in that instant, something shifted. Because Harry finally understood the game he thought he was playing had ended. This wasn't sibling rivalry. This wasn't media warfare. This wasn't even family estrangement. This was institutional logic. And institutional logic does not care how you feel. Harry had spent years believing that by telling his story, by being honest, by speaking openly about pain and trauma, he was leveling the playing field. That transparency was power. But what he failed to grasp was this. Transparency is only powerful when the other side needs your truth. And they didn't. That's the moment Harry realized the imbalance. He had been fighting emotionally. They had been operating structurally. And structure always wins. Let's talk about what that realization does to someone. Harry wasn't naive. He knew the monarchy was an institution. He knew it was rigid, strategic, calculated. But he had always believed there were limits. That family would override structure at some point. That shared history would matter. That loyalty, however strained, would still count. What he was discovering now was brutal. Structure doesn't bend for sentiment. It absorbs it, and then it moves on. This is where Harry's emotional journey diverges sharply from Meghan's. Meghan saw elimination. Harry felt betrayal. Not because someone attacked him, but because no one came. No warning. No outreach. No attempt to soften the blow. Just distance. And distance, when you're used to protection, feels like abandonment. Harry replayed moments in his head. Conversations with his brother. Shared grief. Shared history. He couldn't reconcile those memories with the reality unfolding around him. How could someone who knew him so well allow this? The answer, once it surfaced, was devastating. Because this wasn't personal anymore. This was succession. And succession does not allow for unpredictability. Harry realized, too late, that he had become unpredictable, not because of his intentions, but because of his actions. Every interview, every revelation, every public expression of pain, they weren't just emotional releases. They were variables. And variables are dangerous in systems designed to last centuries. That's when Harry saw the chessboard clearly for the first time. He wasn't playing against his brother. He was playing against time. And time was not on his side. This realization triggered a wave of emotions Harry had never had to process before. Regret, confusion, anger. But beneath all of it, loss. Loss of position. Loss of belonging. Loss of certainty. Harry had always known who he was in relation to the institution. The spare. The rebel. The protected one. Now he didn't know who he was at all. And that identity crisis hit harder than any public criticism ever could. Here's where the contradiction deepens. Harry didn't want power. He wanted acknowledgement. He wanted to be seen. But the institution wasn't interested in acknowledgement anymore. It was interested in stability. And stability required distance from him. That truth hurt in a way he wasn't prepared for. Because it meant his pain, however real, was irrelevant. His story, however compelling, was no longer useful. The system had calculated the cost of engaging with him and decided it was too high. Harry reportedly tried to reach out. Not publicly, not dramatically. Privately. Quiet attempts to reconnect. To clarify. To understand. But those attempts met something worse than rejection. They met formality. Polite responses. Non-committal language. Carefully worded phrases. That's when Harry knew. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a boundary. And boundaries, once set, are not crossed casually. For the first time in his life, Harry felt truly alone. Not physically, emotionally. Because isolation inside a family is far more painful than isolation outside it. He couldn't storm out. He had already left. He couldn't fight back. There was nothing to fight. He couldn't appeal. There was no court. Just a slow, unmistakable understanding that he had overestimated his leverage. And that realization carried another sting. He had underestimated William. Not as a brother. As a strategist. William wasn't reacting emotionally. He wasn't punishing Harry. He was protecting the future. And that future no longer had room for instability. Harry began to see moments from the past differently. Silences that he had ignored. Warnings he had dismissed. Concerns he had brushed off as overcautious. They weren't overreactions. They were signals. Signals he hadn't understood because he had never needed to. Until now. This is the moment where Harry's internal narrative collapsed. The idea that truth would set him free. The idea that public support would force reconciliation. The idea that family ties were unbreakable. All of it crumbled under the weight of reality. Reality doesn't reward vulnerability in institutions. It rewards predictability. And Harry had become the opposite of predictable. This realization didn't make him angry at William. It made him angry at himself. For not seeing it sooner. For believing emotion could outmaneuver structure. For thinking love was a shield against consequence. That self-directed anger is the most corrosive kind. Because there's no one to confront. No one to blame. Just a growing sense that he had walked into a battle without understanding the rules. And the rules had never been fair. Harry finally understood that the institution had never been designed to accommodate dissent from within. It was designed to absorb it, or push it out. And he had pushed too hard. This chapter ends at the moment Harry stopped waiting for someone to rescue him. Stopped expecting a call that would change everything. Stopped believing that this could be undone. Because if this wasn't a fight, if it was simply a process, then the outcome had already been determined. And the most terrifying part? The process wasn't finished yet. What came next wouldn't target his emotions. It would target perception. And once perception shifts, everything follows. Why now? That's the question that keeps resurfacing. Why this moment? Why not earlier, when the noise was louder? Why not later, when the dust had settled? Because timing isn't accidental. And this chapter is about timing. About precision. About why this move, delivered quietly and without spectacle, landed with maximum force exactly when it did. This chapter begins with a simple but unsettling truth. The most powerful decisions are made when no one is watching. By the time Harry understood the fight was over, the institution had already chosen the moment to act. Not impulsively, not emotionally, strategically. And that timing is what turned pressure into inevitability. Ask yourself something. When is the best time to make a controversial decision? When everyone is paying attention? Or when attention is scattered, diluted, exhausted? The answer explains everything. This move did not happen at the peak of outrage. It happened after outrage fatigue set in. The public had already heard the arguments, already formed opinions, already moved on to the next cycle of drama. And that's exactly why this moment was chosen. Because decisions made during emotional saturation get challenged. Decisions made during emotional exhaustion get accepted. By this point, the story of Harry and Meghan had become familiar, predictable, repetitive. Another headline, another reaction, another round of debate. People weren't shocked anymore. They were tired. And tired audiences don't mobilize. They don't protest. They don't organize. They don't demand explanations. They shrug. That's the window. Inside palace strategy circles, timing isn't about calendars. It's about conditions. And the conditions were perfect. Global attention was fractured. Media focus was divided. Public appetite for royal drama was waning. At the same time, something else was happening quietly. William's position had stabilized. Not publicly. Institutionally. He was no longer being framed as the future. He was being treated as the present. That shift matters. Because institutions behave differently when they believe leadership is settled. They stop hedging. They stop delaying. They stop accommodating outliers. They act. This is where timing becomes lethal. Because the moment William's authority was internally secure, ambiguity became intolerable. Harry and Meghan represented ambiguity, not because of who they were, but because of what they symbolized. Unpredictability, external pressure, narrative volatility, and institutions hate volatility, especially when succession is on the horizon. The timing also coincided with a subtle but important shift in how the public viewed silence. Earlier, silence had been interpreted as weakness, as avoidance, as inability to respond. Now, silence read as control. People were used to the idea that if William and Catherine wanted to respond, they could. The fact that they didn't started to look intentional. And intention implies confidence. Confidence invites trust. Trust creates cover. This is how timing multiplies impact. When the public expects noise and gets silence, they assume something is being handled behind the scenes. They don't demand explanations. They assume authority is doing its job. That assumption is everything, because it allowed the institution to move without resistance. Let's talk about optics. Not the flashy kind, the structural kind. At this point, Harry and Meghan's visibility was no longer translating into leverage. It was translating into fatigue. Every appearance felt like a continuation of the same unresolved story. And unresolved stories lose power over time. That's when the system stepped in, not to escalate. To conclude, the charity rename, the functional hollowing of titles, the quiet distancing, none of it needed justification anymore. Because the audience wasn't asking why. They were asking what's next. And the institution answered that question in its own way, by removing uncertainty. Timing also neutralized backlash from supporters. Supporters thrive on momentum, on urgency, on the feeling that something unjust is happening right now. But when changes roll out slowly, procedurally, without a single flashpoint, urgency evaporates. There's nothing to rally against, no villain to point at, no moment to freeze frame and protest, just a sense that things have shifted, and shifts are hard to reverse. Insiders describe this phase as the settling period, the moment when the system allows new norms to form quietly. Once norms form, resistance feels outdated. This is where timing intersects with psychology. People resist sudden change. They adapt to gradual change. By spacing out the moves, the institution allowed the public to adjust without realizing it was adjusting. One update here, one reframing there, one absence that used to be a presence. Each on its own was unremarkable. Together, they rewrote reality. Harry and Meghan were no longer central to the royal conversation. They were adjacent. And adjacency is a dangerous place to be. Because once you're adjacent, you can be edged out completely. Timing also ensured something else. Plausible deniability. Had this happened earlier, critics could have argued it was retaliatory. Had it happened later, it could have been framed as punitive. But happening now, it looked administrative. Necessary. Long overdue. And necessity is the most powerful justification of all. No one argues with necessity. They accept it. This is why the timing felt so devastating to Harry. He wasn't just losing ground. He was losing the ability to frame the loss as unjust. Because the moment had passed. The emotional high ground was gone. The public had already moved on. And once public emotion cools, institutions gain freedom. Freedom to finalize. Harry reportedly felt this acutely. He realized that even if he spoke out now, it would land differently. Not as revelation, as repetition. And repetition doesn't inspire outrage. It inspires indifference. That's the cruel genius of timing. It turns noise into background sound. Meghan understood this too, perhaps more clearly than Harry. She saw that the window for reframing the narrative had closed. That any attempt to escalate would look disproportionate, reactive, desperate. And desperation is exactly what the institution had been waiting for them to avoid. Because desperation undermines credibility. This is where the trap snaps shut. If they stayed quiet, the changes would solidify. If they spoke out, they would confirm the perception of instability. Either way, the outcome favored the institution. That's not coincidence. That's design. Timing also protected allies. People who might have been sympathetic earlier now had covered a step back. They could say, "It's already settled," or "That's above my pay grade," or "This has been decided." Those phrases end conversations. And ending conversations is how power consolidates. This chapter also marks the point where media behavior subtly changed. Not because journalists were instructed, but because incentives shifted. Editors sensed the story was losing heat. Producers sensed audience fatigue. Coverage became less breathless, more analytical, more distant. That shift matters. Because analytical coverage legitimizes institutional decisions. It frames them as outcomes, not controversies. And once that framing takes hold, reversal becomes unlikely. Harry and Meghan were no longer being covered as disruptors. They were being covered as consequences. And consequences don't get second acts. Here's the hardest part to accept. Timing didn't just protect the institution. It isolated Harry and Meghan. It ensured that by the time they fully grasped what was happening, there were no pressure points left to press. No urgency to exploit. No emotional swell to ride. Just a slow realization that the moment to intervene had passed. This is what people mean when they say the move was fatal. Not because it destroyed anything outright, but because it closed windows. And closed windows don't reopen easily. This chapter ends at the precise moment when insiders say the last option evaporated. The moment when it became clear that this wasn't about managing a crisis anymore. It was about managing the aftermath. And once you're in the aftermath phase, the narrative no longer belongs to you. It belongs to the system that outlasted you. But the timing wasn't just about when. It was also about where. Because the next shift wouldn't happen in headlines or public perception. It would happen closer. Inside the inner circle. Among people Harry thought he could still count on. And when that circle began to fracture, that's when the consequences became impossible to ignore. Why did the silence suddenly feel louder than the outrage? That's the question that haunted newsrooms, palace corridors, and inner circles alike. Because something strange was happening. The headlines were still there. The commentary still rolled on. The debates still flared up on social media. But underneath all of it, something had changed. The noise was no longer moving anything. And this chapter is about that moment, when media chaos collided with palace stillness and lost. This is the point where two completely different strategies faced each other head-on. One side shouted, the other side waited, and only one of them understood how power really works. Let's start with the meltdown. Because make no mistake, there was one. From the outside, it looked like business as usual. Panels arguing, commentators speculating, think pieces recycling familiar arguments. But inside media circles, something else was unfolding. Editors were uneasy, producers were hesitant, and reporters began asking a question they hadn't asked before. What's actually new here? That question is fatal to a story, because once journalists start asking it, the clock is already running out. Harry and Meghan's situation had become complicated to cover. There were no fresh revelations, no new villains, no decisive moments to anchor a narrative. Just a slow accumulation of procedural changes that didn't translate well on screen. And television hates procedure. Procedure doesn't cry. It doesn't shout. It doesn't give you a clip that goes viral. Silence, on the other hand, does something unexpected. It forces people to speculate. And speculation is oxygen for institutions that know how to wait. While media outlets scrambled to interpret what was happening, the palace did something deeply unsettling. Nothing. No denial. No clarification. No reassurance. Just consistency. Every appearance from William and Catherine was calm, measured, focused on work, on duty, on the future. No reference to drama. No acknowledgement of controversy. And that lack of engagement created a psychological imbalance. Because the media thrives on reaction. When there is no reaction, narratives collapse under their own weight. Journalists began filling the silence themselves. Some suggested this was a deliberate de-escalation. Others speculated that decisions had already been made behind the scenes. A few quietly admitted they no longer knew where the story was going. That's when the meltdown truly began. Not in headlines. In uncertainty. Let me ask you something. Have you ever argued with someone who refused to respond? Not angrily. Not dismissively. Just didn't engage. It's infuriating. Because argument requires participation. And participation is a form of acknowledgement. By refusing to engage, the palace denied the media the one thing it needed most. Relevance. This is where the contrast becomes brutal. Harry and Meghan's side was loud, emotional, expressive. The palace was neutral, procedural, unmoved. And in a world overloaded with outrage, neutrality reads as authority. Viewers began to notice. Not consciously, instinctively. There was no panic coming from the palace. No scrambling. No sense of damage control. And that absence sent a powerful message. They're not worried. And if they're not worried, why should we be? This is how public perception shifts without anyone announcing it. The media meltdown intensified because journalists couldn't find a clear villain. Every time someone tried to frame William and Catherine as aggressors, the evidence felt thin. No statements. No attacks. No retaliatory interviews. Just decisions unfolding quietly. That made accusations harder to sustain. Because outrage needs targets. And silence is a terrible target. It absorbs anger without reflecting it. At the same time, Harry and Meghan's visibility began working against them. Every appearance, every quote, every leak felt familiar. Not shocking. Not new. Familiarity breeds fatigue. And fatigue kills momentum. Producers began asking if audiences were still invested. Editors began trimming coverage. Stories that once led bulletins were pushed lower, not because they weren't dramatic, but because they weren't moving. Meanwhile, palace silence.